You're listening to the Persistence Mastery Podcast to give your communication skills the clarity edge with your host, Paul Leon.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I do want to take this time to say thank you so much for those who are listening and sharing this podcast. Some really strong data analytics on the back end. And if this podcast is really helping you, don't be afraid to share some feedback or your communication medium by visiting our website and just hitting the button email. If you find this podcast could help someone else, or just the communication could really be an asset to you and your team, don't hesitate to share this. It really helps the channel. It helps people find this really good information to elevate communication skills and give people the clarity edge. So, with that said, let's get into today's subject, which are some tips on impactful questions. And the goal of this episode is really to give you some empowerment in these tips and how you can have quality conversations to where when you first make a connection with someone and the conversation ends, that you can maybe nurture a new relationship or have that personal network being built in the area you're in. So that's the goal of this episode. And with that said, let's get right into the content. So the first tip is when you're conversating with someone, one type of impactful question is one that you can structure on you wanting to be educated on something. So that could look something like this. Let's say you've just made a new connection, whether it's LinkedIn, some other social media medium, or in person. You're in between projects, lunch, etc. You could simply, in the middle of striking up the conversation, just simply ask them, because they may talk about themselves on a particular subject. Look for opportunities to be educated. So let's say that this person works at a certain job where they do X, whatever that is, and they're talking about their job. When you have that moment, that 10-second moment of silence where you may be tempted to interject your thoughts, simply replace that with the question on, you talked about this X project at your job. Educate me on how that you came to that project. So asking a question to be educated by this other individual is a really powerful way that you can prioritize them and strengthen that connection for that new relationship that you may or may not have with this person you just met. The next tip is looking for areas to explore. So people love to talk on themselves. They love to educate you on things they know and maybe you do not know. And even if you know something, don't be tempted to interject your thoughts with this new connection simply because having these impactful questions, allowing this person to talk about more of themselves, there's a psychology that goes into it. The more they talk about themselves and you're the one leading the questions, the more they want to reciprocate or commit to you as a person in future states. And that's not always going to be the case. People are very busy, but it's a lot of the psychology that goes into conversation. So the next tip outside of the education questions are exploratory questions. So going back, so if you ask them that education question, educate me on X, look for ways that you can back up the education they're talking about into more of an exploratory type part of the conversation. And a question like that might be like, I'm getting a lot of good value based on what you're telling me. I guess what I'm trying to better understand is, how does this communicate in these other XYZ areas based on what you're telling me? So, asking more exploratory questions as well to get that person talking further is a strong way that you can nurture the relationship and have these questions make a stronger connection with this new person that you're communicating with or meeting for the first time, or maybe meeting for a second time. So the next tip is what I like to say, humanizing questions. Ways that you can kind of engage this person further in the conversation but also humanize the relationship, especially in a cold connection or ongoing one. Let me give you an example of some humanizing questions I like to ask in conversations with meeting people for the first time. So, one question I'll ask if I'm already been asking education questions, exploratory questions, I might ask a humanizing question to if I want to meet this person again, if I want future state, allow them into my circle of relationships because I feel that they could be value and I could be add value to them. I'll ask a question like, if I was a member of your family, how would you explain X to me? That is what I call a humanizing question. Now, in sales, a lot of the time, they may say something like, hey, if you were my mom, this is what I would do. If you were my dad, or if your dad X. And I stray away from framing the question that way is because not everybody's family members has a mom or dad. There's a lot of pretty intense stories out there and meeting thousands of people over my career. So what I do is I don't say, you know, if you were my mom or if you were my dad, that can cause some major issues and it can get you into some trouble. Simply humanize the question by saying, if I was a member of your family, how would you teach me X? How would you communicate X to me of what's in it for me? And I like that because not every family may have a dad or a mom, etc. But every version of a family is different from people's background experiences. So, with that said, take these impactful questions and leverage them into your future and ongoing conversations to really make an impact on new relationships going forward.
Thank you for listening to the Persistence Mastery Podcast. Subscribe to where you listen to podcasts. And if you want to hire Paul to train or speak for your team, visit persistencemastery.com and fill out the request training form.